Good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction. I just want to thank the organizers of Perfusion Solutions
I just want to thank our team members for presented with live
for giving me this opportunity. The first time we had the first successful ECMO in 1971, right up until now, until 2022. I think over the end of this particular presentation, you'll probably walk away with a better understanding of where we were and where we're going today, or where we're at today. As you all know, the first successful adult ECMO that was done by Dr. Donald Hill in Santa Barbara, California. And I also think it's important. What was kind of unique about it being the first ECMO that was done on a human, a successful ECMO, it had a built-in heat exchanger. In between these silicone membrane plates, there was also a little bed of water, or these beds of water that were contained, and that acted as a heat exchanger. So it was quite an interesting device, but quite a fearsome looking device when you look at it. If you take a look at the screen, you can see there's somebody back here with a set of greens on, and there's his arm extended out. And up here you can see his head, and that's the front of the machine on this side. So I'm not 100% certain, but I can pretty well hazard a guess that was Angelo, and he probably didn't move for the 3 days that this run went on. And because those days sitting in front of the machine was routine, and especially in this first case. As you all know, the first successful pediatric ECMO was done by Dr. Bartlett. And again, the perfusionist that done that particular case for them was Nick Hayduke, and they did this in 1973. It was a pediatric patient, a 2-year-old patient that had transposition of the great vessels done, and it was about 30 hours later that he started to fail, and so they put him on veno-arterial ECMO. Dr. Bartlett put him on veno-arterial ECMO. That ECMO run lasted for about 34 hours, and once again, the patient survived and came off of ECMO. You can see the membrane that he used at that time was called the Landy-Edwards membrane, and it had the same sort of technology that the Bramson heart-lung machine had. It had parallel plate silicone membrane layers. A pretty simple device. If you take a look at it, you can see the input came down at the bottom and the arterial output came out the top. It had to have an external heat exchanger. And there was even an opportunity that you could link 2 or 3 of these devices together, I should say. They came in 3 different sizes. They came in the 1 meter squared, the 2 meters squared, and the 3 meters squared. And this particular one, a 3 meters squared, was used on this 2-year-old. Also at that time, as you can see, that was the start of using the servo-regulated pumps, using the roller pump, and then the servo-regulated bladder sort of came from this and sort of kept on going for years after. The one thing about these Landy-Edwards membranes is they used to accumulate a lot of water into the gas port, and you had to burp the gas port to get the water out of them every now and then. And then Dr. Bartlett went on in 1975. Dr. Bartlett, Nick Hayduke, I should say, went on in 1975, and they did the first successful neonate ECMO. It was a new infant, or a newborn infant. It was 20 hours after being born, who went into respiratory failure, and they put her on veno-arterial ECMO. I'm sure we all know this particular patient called Baby Esperanza. It's in all of the literature. The run lasted for about 6 days, and once again, she did well on that membrane. The Collabo membrane was developed in 1965 by Dr. Collabo, and he first used that membrane on a 10-year-old pediatric patient in 1974 with leukoblastic leukemia. That ECMO run ran it for about 5 days. The thing about the Collabo membrane, it has 6 different sizes. You would have to pick one of the sizes for your patient. It ran with the 0.4 meters squared, the 0.8, the 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, all the way up to a 4.5 meters squared. You can see this one down in the picture down here. That one there looks like to be about a 3.5 or 4.5. The larger ones had a built-in heat exchanger through the center core, and the membrane itself was made of silicone rubber. And it was made in these sheets of silicone rubber that were wrapped around, spirally wrapped around the center core. With the heat exchanger, that center core was the heat exchanger, and with the smaller ones, you had to use an external heat exchanger. The company that first marketed it was called Symed Corporation, and it became known as the Symed membrane, and then later on it was sold to Medtronic, and it was known as the Avicor membrane. This particular design of oxygenator more or less dominated the ECMO runs in North America here up until the early 2000s. It became the standard of care for ECMOs in adults, pediatrics, and infants. But infants, there was another oxygenator. We'll talk about that in a second. In 1979, a paper was published that really had a huge impact on adult ECMO. That paper was published by Dr. Sapol. It was a major report done on ECMO, supported by an NIH grant. As a prospective randomized controlled trial with 9 different centers involved. And they looked at 87 severe ARDS patients. What they wanted to find out in this paper, in this 1979 paper, was did ECMO really help with adults who had severe ARDS and were being supported by mechanical ventilation? As you can see, they put 45 patients in the mechanical ventilation group and 42 in the mechanical ventilation plus ECMO group. Overall, the results were dismal. They were very bad results that didn't do much for ECMO, for adult ECMO. There was only 4 survivors in the CMV group, and there was 4 survivors in the CMV plus ECMO group. To give you the percentages that you see there, 8.8% for CMV and 9.5% for CMV plus ECMO. Overall, it was found or determined in this particular paper that ECMO didn't increase survivability and was really not a type of therapy that was going to benefit the patients with mechanical ventilation. If you look at the bottom of the paper, you can see that besides Dr. Zapol, Dr. Hill participated in this particular study, and so did Dr. Bartlett. It was published in the Journal of American Medical Association. It was several years or many years later that Dr. Bartlett made a comment on this particular paper, and he said this one single paper more or less stopped the development of adult ECMO for a period of over 20 years. Neonatal and pediatric ECMO progressed because the results were coming out and showing that there was useful and very good results. But this particular paper more or less stunned the adult ECMO world. I came into the practice around 1981. And when I came into the practice, the word around ECMO was not too good. We always got the patients late. The intensivists, the pulmonologists, the intensivists, the medical practitioners in ICU did not want to put their patients on ECMO. So they never referred them to the cardiac surgery at the time, because that was the ones who ran the ECMO, was cardiac surgery and perfusion. And by the time we got them, they were always in really bad shape. They were pretty edematous. They were fluid overloaded. Kidneys were starting to fail, and they would give them over to ECMO. And of course, the results were pretty negative. They were not that good. The attitude around ECMO back then with adult ECMO was that it was not very good. Not many people wanted to do respiratory cases with them. Some of the cardiac cases did well, the ones that were supported post-cardiac surgery, but it wasn't a real good time for ECMO. So between 1979 and 2007, there was some things that were going on that were notable in the development of ECMO. First of all, the silicone rubber, as I said, the Symed and the Avicor, they were the go-to standard of care with larger patients. And with the neonates and the infants in the United States especially, the Carmida-coated membrane devices, membrane oxygenators, were being used in that patient population. The skinned hollow fiber technology was developing in Europe, And as you know, when I mean skinned hollow fiber technology, I mean polymethylpentene or PMP. In fact, it was being used in Europe many years before it was brought over to North America. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. The patients that we were getting, as I said, they were heavily sedated, they were intubated, and they rarely moved in bed. In fact, it was counterintuitive for any of us to want to move the patients because we were afraid that the cannulas were going to kink or dislodge, and it was even a big deal just to change the bed linen in these patients in the earlier years. As I told you, the coagulation, the bleeding, the fluid management in these patients was always a problem. We started bringing dialyzers into the intensive care units to help with the managing them, and then CRRT came along. And they were managed 24/7 bedside, these ECMO cases. So if you can imagine with these particular patients, if you had a small perfusion department with about 8 or 9 perfusionists, and you had one adult ECMO case going and one pediatric ECMO case going, or neonate, these were manned 24/7, 3 8-hour shifts a day. So you can imagine what it did to the cardiac program. In fact, the cardiac program would almost come to a standstill during these cases when they were running. So they weren't popular with the surgeons, they weren't popular with the medical practitioners. So it was difficult managing them. As the years got on, it got a little easier. So when I'm talking about the skinned hollow fiber technology, this PMP membranes, they came over into Canada first, coming over to North America from Europe. They came over in the form of the Quadrox D membranes. Once they came over, and that was around the year 2000 when they came in. Once they came in, we found that they had smaller surface areas, no plasma leakage. They were easy to use and prime, and they dramatically reduced the inventory costs of stocking membranes for the adult and pediatric populations. Here in the United States, the use of these polymethylpentene membranes really didn't come into the U.S. until around the year 2009. Prior to that, the standard of care, as I said, was the Avicor membranes and these Carmida-coated hollow fiber membranes, the Minimax and the Minimax Plus. Now, as I think anybody who's been in perfusion for a while knows, that the standard of care, or I should say the criteria for these type of oxygen, for all membrane oxygenators, whether they're hollow fiber, they're PMP membranes for ECMOs, or whatever, they're flat plate, whatever the technology was, all membrane oxygenators are only validated for a maximum use of 6 hours at a time. We knew that when these PMP membranes came over into North America. And so what the manufacturers decided to do was to prove that their oxygenators could last for longer than 6 hours. When you're talking about these oxygenators being regulated or mandated to be a maximum of 6 hours of use, this is coming from the ISO regulations, or the International Standards Organization, the AMI organizations, or the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, and the federal regulatory boards like the FDA, Health Canada, and all these other regulatory boards adopted those practices. So the manufacturers thought, well, if we could give them a validation period, this would give more confidence for their use. So what they did is like I said, it wasn't a regulatory requirement. The manufacturers themselves determine the validation periods. They determine how long they run and when they terminate them. That's at their discretion, each manufacturer's discretion. And the reason they do the validation periods is really to determine, or to set, or to show, I should say, that these oxygenators can give good oxygen transfers and steady and reliable oxygen transfers up to a period of time, and good CO2 removal. The way they did that is they ran them in ex vivo conditions using heparinized blood primes. And these heparinized blood primes were run for 24 hours, and then the primes were removed and a new blood prime was put in and run for another 24 hours. And they did this every time to determine the validation periods. And so I'm sure you've heard most of the manufacturers talking about their validation periods for individual oxygenators. Some of them will run for will be validated for 5 days, and some of them will be validated for periods of 15 days, I believe. The FDA never recognized validation periods. They still stuck with their maximum of 6 hours per use. But as you know, with ECMO, it's always much longer than 6 hours per use. But that was the responsibility of the physician to take that responsibility on, even though they were using it outside of the FDA regulations. That changed in 2020 when the FDA put an emergency use authorization in to help get through this pandemic, and giving the qualifications that these devices could be used for long-term support. How long that'll last, or if that's there forever, I don't know. But with ECMO, it's always long-term use. That's why we use them. In my opinion, there was 3 major turning points that came along with adult ECMO. And one of them was the start of the H1N1 virus, or the swine flu, that came along in the years 2008 and 2009. As we know, the H1N1 virus was believed to originated in Mexico in swine, and then it's spread out to other countries from there. It hit the United States and Canada pretty badly. I don't know how bad it was or which one had it worse, but I do know in Canada we were putting a lot of patients on ECMO. During that time, when we were putting these patients on ECMO, they were starting to get a new interest and a new trust in the use of ECMO from the intensivists, from the medical practitioners outside of the cardiac OR, and they were relying on these devices to help their patients through. So that really started to change the landscape in regards to the communications between that medical practice and the medical practice that we have in the cardiac OR. The other thing that changed things was the Giles Peak paper that came out, the Caesar trial in 2009. Now, this particular trial was set up to run 90 patients on ECMO and 90 patients with conventional mechanical ventilation. They didn't reach their numbers. There was some criticism about their methodology. But nonetheless, when this paper was published, they reported that patients that were put on ECMO, in severe ARDS patients that were put on ECMO, had a survival rate of 63%, whereas those with conventional mechanical ventilation only had a survival rate of 43%. Now you have to imagine for yourself, this particular paper had the same impact on the medical community and the perfusion community and the ECMO specialist community as did the paper from Zapol back in 1979. This was a positive influence. This really started to bring more attention to adult ECMO. And of course, we all know the worldwide coronavirus, COVID, SARS-CoV-2, whatever you want to call it, came along in 2019. And the use of ECMO just basically exploded at this particular point. The amount of ECMO being used worldwide to support patients was inspiring, especially in the adult population. If you look at the numbers through the ELSO organization, and you look at the statistics, all of the statistics have made improvements over the past decade or so, but the adult population just exploded. This is good, promoted more research, more interest, more different types of communications, and it was good. So how do we know that this made changes? Well, if you go to PubMed, for example, there's a simple way to do it. You go to PubMed and you put in the words extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, and you combine that with the term ECMO, ECMO, and you put it in PubMed. Looking between the years of 1972 and 2008, that's a period of 36 years, there is 4,175 abstracts or papers that were published on that topic, on those topics. So just to give you an idea of how it expanded, that would equal out to about 10 papers or 10 publications per month over those 36-year period. Then when you put in the years 2009 to 2019, that's only 10 years, a 10-year period, coming from that first H1N1 virus period. There was 9,675 abstracts or papers that were published in PubMed. That works out to an average of about 81 papers per month when you do the numbers on it. And then finally, if you look between 2020 and 2022, it's not even a full 2 years yet. And that works out to 5,695 abstracts that have appeared in that year and a half, basically, papers that are published on ECMO. When you do the numbers on that, that's an average of 237 papers that are appearing every month in the literature about ECMO. It's basically that explosion of ECMO. When we're talking about PMP membranes, because that's the standard of care for ECMO around the world now, when you're talking about PMP membranes, there's really two different types that are on the market. One type is called the low resistance types, and the other ones are the high resistance types. Here in North America, we've sort of centered our attention around the low resistance types, the McKay Quadrox D series. They're new technology, but they're all low resistance type of oxygenators. The Medtronic came up with a new one called the Nautilus ECMO. That's also a low resistance type of membrane. And then you've also got the high resistance type of membranes. You've got LivaNova has the tandem lung. They've got the EOS ECMO for the pediatrics and infants. Mitos came up with a Highlight LT long-term series. In fact, Mitos developed their polymethylpentene oxygenators before the Quadrox D did, but the McKay product did. And the Paragon has the Paragon PMP series. The Eurosets has the AL1 ECMO. And KPOX is just coming out with a new one called the KPOX LS. What's interesting is the high resistance type of PMP membranes are widely used in Europe, Asia, and in Latin America. But some of them are coming over into North America at this point. Trust me, I've been to many different centers. I've talked to many perfusionists. I've been at many conferences around the world on ECMO. And the results that they're getting with the high resistance type devices are just as impressive and just as good as what they're getting with the low resistance devices. In fact, if you look at some of the European literature, the results are actually a little better than what we're finding here in North America for the types of cases that are being managed. The benefit with the high resistance of devices is that they tend to remove gaseous microemboli more easily than what the low resistance devices do. And that's just simply because of the pressure differential between the inside of the fibers and the outside. Now, back in 1989, Dr. Bartlett started up the ELSO organization. His purpose to start up the ELSO organization back then was basically to try to gather all of the information in North America that of centers that were using ECMO, so that he could take that information and put it into a database that could be used by other centers who wanted to do ECMO and wanted to find out what the technology is, what the best devices to use, what kind of output or outcomes they're getting with ECMO. And then that sort of expanded from there. And in 2011, Europe and the Euro ELSO developed their own chapter. They're reporting to ELSO, of course. In 2012, the Asian Pacific group, the Latin American group, they started their own chapters, again, reporting to ELSO. And in 2017, the Southwest Asia and Africa chapter was developed. And once again, all of these chapters are feeding into the ELSO organization. So overall, presently there's over 543 centers that are reporting their ECMO cases and their ECMO numbers to ELSO. The amount of patients right now, the amount of cases that ELSO has in regards to database collection is over 178,000 cases. That's the largest gathering of database or data on ECMO that I know of anywhere in the world. It's a very impressive amount of data that they have, and everybody has access to it who joins. So using some of the ELSO registry information, I looked at the respiratory ECMO cases that occurred in 3 different time periods, but more specifically, starting with 2011, you can see the survival rate in 2011 of ECMO with the adult respiratory ECMO cases was 64%, and now in 2021, it's up to 67%. You can see how the caseloads expanded from 2011 to 2021. The pediatric respiratory ECMO cases had a survival rate of 65% in 2011. Now it's up to 72% in 2021. Neonatal respiratory ECMO cases, 85% in 2011, up to 87% in 2021. Doing the same thing with the cardiac ECMO cases. The adult cardiac ECMO cases had a survival of only 54% in 2011, and now they're up to 59% in 2021. Excuse me. In the pediatric cardiac ECMO cases, survival rate was 65% in 2011, and now it's 72% in 2021. And neonatal cardiac ECMO cases, 61% in 2011, and now it's up to 69%. And the last one I took out of their database was with the adult ECPR ECMO, extracorporeal cardiopulmonary resuscitation, of course. In 2011, the survival rate was 37% in the adult population, and it hasn't got much better. In 2021, it's still only 41%. And you got to remember that this is from data from a massive database of ECMO cases. There may be some centers that are getting better results than other centers, but overall, these are the survival rates. And these survival rates that you have here are the ones that of all of this data is those that have survived the ECMO run, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the survival rate to those that were discharged home. Those are lower results. In the pediatric ECPR ECMO cases, survival rate was 54% in 2011. Now it's up to 59%. And neonatal ECPR was 63% in 2011, and now it's up to 70%. As you can see, in all cases, there's been an advancement and an improvement in the stats. And some of the reasons that's for, one of them is the technology's gotten better. The understanding of that technology's gotten better. The cannulations are better. There's much more veno ECMO than there is veno arterial now. The point of care devices that we use in the intensive care are much more easier to use. We used to have to draw up, you'd lose in the 70s and 80s, you could lose as much as 300 and 400 cc's a day just for sampling. Now you've got point of care technology to look at coagulation profiles, blood gas analysis, ACTs, anything else that you want to look at, point of care technology is there. But the biggest improvement, I think, in my opinion, being in the business for a long period of time, is the immense cooperation between all people. Now, we've got ECMO specialists that have made a great difference, that they look after ECMO cases now, that's their specialty. You've got surgeons that are cooperating with the intensivists, with the practitioners, with the pulmonologists. I mean, all of them have a greater understanding of ECMO, and now they can see much more benefits that they can use this technology on. And this has made a huge difference in adult ECMO cases. If you take a look way back in 1971, you could see this is where it started and what the cases looked like. And throughout the years, it got a little better and better. And if you go to look in 2022, we now see patients that are up and walking around with the support of the ECMO team, of course, right behind them. So you want to make sure nothing moves and gets kinked or anything. Now, don't get me wrong, not all ECMO patients are out walking around. That goes without saying. But nonetheless, this is where we've come. And it's a long road, and it just seems to be getting better and better as we go along. It was Dr. Bartlett who said ECMO was the standard of critical care in pediatrics since the 1990, but it wasn't the standard of care in adults until 2009. In 2016, Dr. Bartlett, this the last slide, and in 2016, Dr. Bartlett did a piece in the Egyptian Journal of Critical Care Medicine. And what he put in that, he put a graph, or he put a chart into that, and he broke it up. He called it ECMO 1 phase, ECMO 2 phase, and ECMO 3 phase. He projected to ECMO 3 phase because obviously he said it was from 2018 on, and he was presenting this in 2016. So he projected this is where it was going. ECMO 1, as he said, was between the years of 1980 and 2008. As I mentioned throughout the presentation, these patients were sedated, paralyzed, intubated. They had resting ventilator settings. They had a specialist, a perfusionist that sat them with 24/7. They used lung recruitment techniques. That's a respiratory technique using PEEP and plateau pressures to prevent atelectatic areas in the lung. And the bleeding was absolutely major in these patients. And then we entered ECMO phase 2, as he calls it, between the years of 2009, that was after the H1N1 virus and the PEEK paper came along, up until 2017. And he said the patients now were at this phase of they're awake, spontaneously breathing, they're either trached or extubated. If they're on ventilators, they're on CPAP. The ICU nurse or the ECMO team was managing the patients. With the lungs, it was like a watch and wait and see what was needed. And the bleeding just got better. It was minor compared to what it was before, which makes a big difference in ECMO management. I don't have to tell you, I'm preaching to the choir. And then he projected for ECMO phase 3. He said that started in 2018 and who knows where it's going to end. But he said at this particular phase, patients will be awake and ambulatory, they'll be extubated, they'll be off the ventilator, they'll have conventional care for weeks or home for months, and they'll have they'll be spontaneously breathing, and in fact, may even not even need any anticoagulation at all. And so we're moving in that particular phase now. But he was pretty well spot on with all of these different phases. And so with that, I'll end the presentation. Hopefully I didn't go too much longer. So I hope you get the chance to enjoy your Indy 500 on Sunday. And if there's any questions, I'm not sure how we'll arrange it, but if you have any, want to give me personally, this is my email address. So thank you very much for the time.